Hello everyone, my name's Kevin. I'm the developer of Impact CFX, and in this video I'm going to be walking you through how to use Impact CFX to create some bullet impacts and footsteps using raycasts. This tutorial already assumes that you have Impact CFX set up in your project and you have a basic knowledge of working with it. So if you're looking for something a bit more introductory, I'd recommend taking a look at the Getting Started tutorial. We're also going to be doing some C# scripting, so I'm also going to assume for this tutorial that you are familiar with that as well. And so with that, let's go ahead and take a look at our character controller here, see what we want to accomplish. So I can move around with my character controller, but there's no feedback or anything for the footsteps as we're walking over our concrete and grass textures. And so I'm going to be using Impact CFX and some raycasts to play those effects. Now, there are a bunch of different ways that you can implement a footstep system. For example, a first-person game versus a third-person game. You're going to have different ways that you might want to implement a footstep system. So I'm not going to be going in depth with the various ways of how you might be able to implement a footstep system. I'm just going to go through the way that I chose to implement it for the character controller included in the Impact demo. Let's actually dive into our character controller script here. Let's go ahead and edit that. We're going to be doing the footsteps first. So if I scroll down here to my late update function, all I'm doing for the footsteps is taking the distance traveled and keeping track of that. And once the distance traveled is greater than a certain threshold, I call the trigger footstep method. And the trigger footstep method is just down here. And what I'm doing in this method is doing a raycast downward from the player's position to get the surface that it's walking over. And basically, that's all you need to do to really set up your code for Impact CFX integration. You just need to do a raycast and get this raycast hit data. So now let's go ahead and go back into Unity. And the first thing I'm going to do here is actually go into my project settings because I need to set up a new tag for my footsteps in the Impact CFX section. So I've already got my hard and soft ones here. I'm going to create a new one and just call it footstep. Alright, so now we can go ahead and start creating our audio effects. Let's take a look at the sound effects I have imported in my project. You can see I have some footsteps here for concrete and for dirt. So let's start by making the concrete footstep audio effect. So let's go to Assets and create a new Impact CFX audio effect. We're going to call this one Concrete Footstep Audio. And we're going to be adding our footstep audio clips to the collision audio clips array, since they're kind of one-shot collision effects. So let's go ahead and add these here. And I'm going to set the collision clip selection mode to be random because I want these clips to be randomly selected from. We don't need any slide or roll audio clips. And for the audio source template, I'm going to use the audio source template prefab that we set up previously and just drag that in there. Now my velocity reference range, I'm not really going to be having any particular velocity for my footstep effects, but I'm just going to set this to a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1. So it's kind of a normalized range that might be easy to work with later if we ever do decide to maybe add some velocity to our footsteps. Maybe if you have a character that can sneak, you might want to adjust the velocity of your footsteps to make them a bit quieter when they're sneaking. And to that effect, I'll actually just leave the scale volume velocity checked so that in the future, if I wanted to add that, I can. But I'm going to set this collision normal influence value to 0 because I don't want the normal of the collision surface to affect the volume of the collision. It's pretty much going to be a straight down raycast anyways, but I'm just going to go ahead and set this to 0 just to make sure. And that is really all I need to do for my audio effect here for the concrete. And so now I can go into my concrete material that I've created previously, and I'm going to add an effect set here for my footsteps. We're just going to call it footstep and set the include tags to be footstep as well. And then just drag in our audio effect there. And then we do the exact same thing for our grass footstep audio effect. So I can just duplicate the concrete footstep audio effect and rename it to grass and clear out our array here. And then just drag in our dirt/grass footstep audio clips. And everything else is the same as before. And then go back into our grass material and create the effect set for footsteps, just like with the concrete. And so now that's all of our assets dealt with. So now we can go into our character controller script and start scripting. So the first thing I'm going to do is go all the way up to the top and add a using statement for the Impact CFX namespace so that we actually get access to the Impact CFX API. And then down here, I have all of my inspector fields defined in this area. And I have a footstep section that I'm going to add a new field to. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a serialized field. And I'm going to add an impact tag field here. And what this will allow me to do is select the impact tag in my script in the inspector. So we can call this footstep tag. And if I save this and go back into my inspector, you can see that there is a field here that now allows me to select a tag from our defined tag, so I can set that to footstep. Now let's hop back into Visual Studio and go down to where we had our trigger footstep method. And what I'm going to be doing here is adding a call to the Impact Raycaster, which is a static helper class that makes triggering effects from Raycast a little bit easier. So let's call Impact Raycaster here. And as you can see here, there are a few methods in Impact Raycaster. You have QRaycast with the 2D and 3D variants, and QRaycast inverted. So the difference between these two is that QRaycast will trigger an effect using the material that we provide to it. So the raycast is effectively kind of acting as an object that triggered a collision using its own material, whereas QRaycast inverted will actually trigger an effect on the object that was hit. So rather than using a given material, we provide an impact tag mask, and then the object that was hit will trigger the effect. And that's what we want to do for our footsteps, because we added the effects to the concrete and grass materials themselves, which are going to be the object that was hit by our raycast. So let's go and use the QRaycast inverted method. And the first parameter here is the raycast hit data, so we can just pass that in. Now our velocity, I'm going to use the vector3.down for my footsteps, since that's the direction of the raycast. Now we have the impact tag mask, and this is different than the impact tag just in that an impact tag is a container for a single impact tag value, whereas an impact tag mask is a container for kind of a collection of impact tags. So we can actually just take our footstep tag here and call toTagMask to easily convert it into a tag mask. Now our footsteps we had defined in the collision clips audio array, so we're going to use a collision type since this is a kind of single event one-shot collision. The raycast ID is an ID that you need to provide whenever you're doing a slider roll collision types. This ID just helps the Impact CFX system keep track of the sliding and rolling effects to make sure the position is updated and the volume is updated and all that kind of stuff. This helps it keep track of the effect. So since we're actually using the collision audio effect, which is kind of a one-shot audio effect, we don't actually need to provide a Raycast ID. So we can just set that to 0. And lastly here, we have the hit object material count. And what this allows us to do is get multiple materials at the kind of Raycast position, the Raycast hit position. And this means that we can actually blend effects together. So for example, if you are walking over a portion of the terrain that has a kind of a blend between grass and concrete, rather than having a binary sort of effect where you're either walking over concrete or grass, whichever happens to be the most influential at that point, you can actually set this to something like 2. And what that'll do is that will get the influence of both materials of concrete and grass at the contact point, and it'll actually blend the effects together based on the material influence at that point. So it can be a bit more natural, a bit more realistic than just the kind of binary effects that you might get if you set this to just 1. So I'm going to set that to 2 so you get that effect blending. And that is all we need to do actually for our footsteps. We just need this one call to the Impact Raycaster method. And we can go back into Unity and go ahead and hit play. So let's see here. So we got our concrete footstep effects. And we have our grass footstep effects. Now let's see if we can find a place where the concrete and grass are kind of blended together, so you can maybe hear that effect blending that I was talking about. Yeah, so you can hear that both the grass and footstep audio effects are playing, kind of blended together. It's a bit more natural. So yeah, that sounds pretty good. So now I said that we were also going to be doing some bullet impact effects. And so what I want to do is whenever the player left clicks, I want to do a bullet impact effect as if they were shooting a gun. In my case, the gun's going to be invisible. But I'm going to want to leave behind some audio, particle, and decal effects. So we're going to be doing all 3 of the built-in effects here for this bullet impact. So let's go ahead and exit play mode there. And this is going to be done very, very similarly to how we just did the footsteps. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at our code. So if we scroll up, we can see if the player left clicks, and assuming we don't have a object that we're currently holding, we're going to trigger a weapon here with this trigger weapon method, so we can go there. And just like with the footstep method, all it's doing is doing a raycast, this time just from the camera's position in the camera direction and getting out a raycast hit. And so we're basically going to be doing the exact same thing that we did for our footsteps. But before we do that, we need to go and set up all of our effect assets and project settings. So I'm going to go into project settings first and create another new tag for bullet. And now we can go ahead and set up our audio, decal, and particle effects. So just like before, going to create an Impact CFX audio effect. And we're going to be doing concrete bullet audio. And then going into our sound effects here. Let's actually take a listen to these. Here's our concrete and our dirt. We can go back here and drag these concrete ones into our collision audio clips list. I'm going to set those to be random and use the same audio source template here. And the last thing I'm going to do is set my velocity reference range to the same 0 to 1 value that I set it to for my footstep audio effect. And I'm also going to move the collision normal influence down to 0. So now we are done with our bullet audio effect. So now we're going to create a particle effect. We're going to go to Assets and Create, Impact CFX, and Particle Effect. Call this one Concrete Bullet Particle. Now, of course, this one has different properties than the audio effect. The first one here is a particle prefab. This is the same as the audio source template prefab property in the audio effect. It's just a prefab that has an impact particles component on it that the system will create instances of at runtime to show the effects. So I can go back into my demo assets. This time going to my particles here. I have particles bullet concrete. So let's go and take a look at that. Let's just play that here. So we got some dust and chunks going. So I'm actually just going to add it to this instance here and then apply that later by going to Impact CFX, Particle, and then Impact Particle System to add that component. So we have all of the particle systems that this effect is going to control. This axis property here defines how the particles will be oriented on the surface. So if we take a look at, say, our chunks here, you can see that they're going kind of in the direction of this z-axis, kind of away from the surface. So that means we want to set our axis to z up. So the z-axis is pointing up, away from the collision surface. And we have various options here, depending on how you have your particle effect authored. And our rotation mode, we do want to align it to the normal. There are a few other options here that we could use, but we're going to align it to the normal. And of course our object pool configuration, we're just going to leave that all as default. And we can go and apply that to our prefab. So now we can go back to our particle effect here and just drag and drop that particle effect prefab. So our particle effect type is a one-shot particle effect. You can also set this to loop if you want to play this particle effect when you're sliding or rolling. We're going to keep that at one shot. And the velocity, just like with the footstep and the other audio effects, we're going to set that to 0 and the collision normal influence to 1 because we don't want any of the velocity or collision normal to affect the particles at all. And finally, for the concrete, we're going to be creating the decal effect. So go up into Impact CFX and select Decal Effect. And call this one Concrete Bullet Decal. And just the same as the other two effects, we're going to need a prefab for this. So we can go into our prefabs folder and go into decals, and let's just take a look at this one. So just a generic bullet decal here. So let's go and add a component. Go to decal, and we're going to click on Impact Decal. This has a similar axis property to the particle effect. In this case, it's Z down because for the URP decal projector, it orients on the Z down. So we want the Z-axis to be facing down into the surface. And by the way, I'm just using the URP built-in decal projector here. Impact CFX, the impact decal, isn't tied specifically to any sort of decal implementation. So if you have any kind of runtime decal system that you would like to use, Impact CFX should be compatible with it. Okay, so let's take a look at rotation mode, just aligning to normal and randomly rotating, so that's good. And this decal distance just defines how much the decal should be pushed away from the surface, because you might have seen if it's right up on the surface, you can sometimes get some Z fighting effects. But this decal distance property will just make sure that it's pushed away from the surface and you won't get any Z fighting artifacts. And we're just going to apply that. And we can get rid of that and go back into our decal effect here and assign our concrete decal. And again, you can choose to create the decals on slide and roll as well as collision, or you can set it to not be created on collision if you want. And there are some various properties here for how the decals are placed whenever you are placing them with sliding and rolling. And again, setting the minimum velocity to 0 and the collision normal influence to 0. Now we have all three of our effects here. So now we can go into our concrete material and create a new effect set for our bullets. So we just rename this here to bullet, set it up with the appropriate tag, and let's get rid of that, and drag and drop all of our effects into this list. So that's our concrete effects done. Now we just do the exact same thing for our grass material to set it up with some grass bullet impact effect. Alright, so I went ahead and set up my bullet effects here. I've got the same thing as the concrete, where I just have my bullet audio effect for the grass and my decal here for the grass and the particles as well. And all of that set up in an effect set on the grass material for bullet. And so now with that done, we can go back into our character controller script and get this set up on the scripting side. So just like before, I'm actually going to go up into our inspector field area and just copy this to create a new tag inspector field for the bullet. And then go back down to my trigger weapon method, and I'm actually just going to copy this impact raycaster call here and paste it here. I'm going to set our velocity vector, this second parameter, to be the camera transforms forward, since that's the direction the ray is going, and of course set the tag to be bullet tag instead of the footstep tag. And again, that's all we need to do to set up our weapons for the impact raycaster here. So now we can go to our character and change this tag here to be bullet. And let's go ahead and play the scene. So when I click on the concrete here, I should see some bullet impact effects. There we go. Here's all of our concrete effects. We got the audio, decal, and particles going. And the same thing with the grass here. There we go. All right, that looks pretty good to me. So as a quick recap of what we've done here, we've added some tags here for our footstep and bullet effects. And we've also created the appropriate effect assets here, our audio, decal, and particle effects for the bullet, and just the audio effects for the footsteps, and added those effect sets to our materials. We've also gone into our character controller script and added these tags here, so we can specify the tags we want to use for our effects. And going into our code, we have added calls to the impact raycaster to actually get effects to play based on our raycasts. And that about does it for this tutorial video. I hope it was helpful for you, and take care.